I want to thank everyone for being here today. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is both a happy day and a hard day. To some of us, today is a reminder of the great mothers that we've had that have been there and nurtured us and trained us in the way of God and led us. And some of us, it might remind us of those who maybe were there for us but didn't lead us in God's ways as they should have. Or worse, it reminds us of hurt and harm done by those who were supposed to take care of us. And for even some, it's a reminder today of something that they desperately want but cannot have. And so we need to make sure to temper our rejoicing also with remembering the pain that some of our sisters and our brothers might be going through today. And so let's be prepared to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And I want to take this opportunity today to express the fact that there are many women in our lives that God uses for His glory. Many women, mothers and sisters and daughters that God uses for His purposes. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So actually in our reading last week, in the opening chapters of Luke, Luke covers Elizabeth and Mary and Anna and some others who were used in God's plan. So God has used and still uses many women in different ways to carry out His purposes and to bless us and to be mothers and to be sisters and all of the things that we need. And we see that in Luke's gospel. So we're going to look at Luke's chapter 1 and 2 this morning. And in that context of Luke, Luke is obviously communicating the story of what has been done and accomplished in the story of Jesus and in the church. And that's what he says at the outset. He's writing to a non-Jewish audience, and he highlights how God used and called different groups through the gospel. And so he spends a lot of time talking about Gentiles and a lot of time talking about women and a lot of time talking about the poor and the marginalized. And that is one of his focuses. And so one of those groups that he highlights is the women that God used in the story of the gospel. And they take a pretty center stage in chapters 1 and 2. So in the beginning of the book that we're going to look at, Luke is showing who Jesus is, that he was foretold that he's divine, that he fulfills God's purposes and is able to save humanity as was the plan. And within that, Luke highlights some of the women who had a very important spot in the origin story, if you can say that, of Jesus. And so really our idea that I want us to take away from this is our central idea, and then we'll ask some reflection questions about it, is that God uses people from all different circumstances and all kinds of different backgrounds, and women from all different walks of life for His plan and for His purposes. Women that can be called our mothers and our daughters and our sisters. And so let's think about them in the Spirit today. So if you look, starting in Luke chapter 1, this is introducing the story of John the Baptist, who is going to be the forerunner, or the one who's going to prepare the way for Jesus. And in Luke chapter 1 and verse 5, it says, "In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years." There's a lot of particular details here that we're given. And so for one, we're going to talk about Zechariah for a little bit. And Zechariah and Elizabeth in their responses are shown as a contrast. But Elizabeth was the wife of a priest. And God noticed both of them and saw their faith. So these two random people, God notices them and saw that they were righteous in trusting Him and walking in the way that He had prepared in the law. But one thing would have been an extremely big shame for them, especially in that culture. They couldn't have children. And now they're very old. And so it seems like a complete impossibility. And if you notice what the angel is going to say to Zechariah in the next few verses that we're going to cover, this is something that Zechariah has prayed for a very, very long time. It's hard to understand a little bit of what that would have been for them. We get it a little bit. But Elizabeth would have carried a tremendous amount of shame because she wouldn't have been able to give her husband heirs for their family, for one thing. And really, Luke is commenting on this. If you look at the relationship between verses 6 and 7, he's saying they were unable to have children, but that was not because they were not righteous. Because very often people thought if you weren't able to bear children, it was because God was punishing you for your sin. But Luke says that's not the case. This is just their predicament. But God had a role for her in his plan. And so we see when Zechariah was doing his duties in the temple, an angel appears to him. It says, but the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. As we said, Zechariah has been praying about this. And you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord, and he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. And Zechariah said to the angel, how shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. And so we look at this. While Zechariah is doing his duties, the angel Gabriel comes and tells him, what you've been praying for is going to happen. Elizabeth is going to bear a son. You're going to call him John, and this is what he's going to do. He's going to be special. He would be an important tool that God used to get the people ready for the coming of his son. But Zechariah asked, how on earth are you going to do that? I'm old. My wife's old. That's not possible. And based on the reaction of the angel, it was a lack of faith on his part. The angel closes his mouth as a lack of faith, but he's looking at it saying, there's no way that this is going to happen. We've wanted this forever. Now we're old. There's no way that this can occur. But look, for instance, at the reaction of his wife. And I have to say in verse 25, I have no idea why my is capitalized, so don't think there's some special emphasis there. That just happened. But it says, after these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among the people. This was a big, big deal. I think we're supposed to see Elizabeth's faith in contrast to her husband's lack of faith and glorifying God for what he was able to do. And she mentions, God, you've noticed me. You've blessed me. He's taken away the shame and the embarrassment, the disgrace that she felt because of her age and her battles with infertility. And God used Elizabeth to provide a great prophet who would get the nation ready for the Son of God. This random old woman. And so I want us to notice in Elizabeth her expectant hope for what God could do. Elizabeth was old and she was unable to have children, and society would have probably ignored her and kind of cast her to the side because she wasn't able to do what she was supposed to do in their eyes. But she showed patient, grateful faith for what God was able to do, and she knew that he could do it. And God noticed her faith. And Elizabeth is not just a lesson for women. None of these women that we're talking about today are just a lesson for women, but Luke presents them as ideal disciples in the way that they are responding to God's plan. And so when we look at Elizabeth, God pays attention to those that hope in him. No matter who you are, if you have faith, if you're this random woman, if you're somebody else, God notices when you are hoping in what he has given you, when you're trusting in what he is able to accomplish. And Elizabeth shows us that he can use you, and he can do that no matter the age or the circumstance. Their age meant nothing to what God was going to do. Absolutely nothing. And God knows those that are his. And he had paid attention to Elizabeth and to Zechariah and the ways that they had trusted and lived their life throughout all of these difficulties that they had experienced. And he used Elizabeth and her hope that she kept. And as we move on in the story, so we talk about the forerunner, John the Baptist, his parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah, and then we move on to Mary. And this is what Jeff read for us this morning. So in the 6th month, and this is probably the 6th month of when Elizabeth is pregnant, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth. And I want to stop there. Nazareth was nowhere. They think there was maybe a couple hundred people living there at this time. This was backwoods. Nobody cared about it. But the angel of the Lord is sent from God to Nazareth, and it keeps getting even better, to a virgin, betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at the saying and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end." That's a lot. To just show up to your house and confront you with something like this. Oh, you are going to bear the Son of God. And Mary is in this story just random, this seemingly random girl who's told by Gabriel that God knows you. He's pleased with you. This random young virgin in Nazareth. And for us to really appreciate what's going on, so based on traditionally what would have been the time for getting engaged and married, Mary is between 13 and 16 years old. She's just a kid. But we can see with the rabbis and what they wrote that the time that a woman would be betrothed was between sometime 12 and 16. So Mary is just a teenager. And the angel is appearing to her and saying that God is noticing her. And obviously she's maybe a little different than we would say our teenagers are today. She seems to be very grown up because of their society there. But she couldn't understand why the angel would be here talking in this way to her. And that's what you see in verse 29. She doesn't understand why are you talking to me about this? But it wasn't about her age. And it wasn't about the fact that she's in some podunk town, and it wasn't about the fact that, as we can see later, Joseph and Mary probably didn't have a lot of money either. God saw her faith, and he was going to use that. And so the angel Gabriel tells her this, and her response in verse 34, and Mary said to the angel, "How will this be since I'm a virgin?" And that might sound the same as what Zechariah said, but it's not at all. And one of the reasons we know that is based on how Gabriel responds. And the angel answered her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, and therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her who is called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. And Mary said, Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word. And the angel departed from her. So instead of saying like Zechariah did, well, how can I really know that this is actually going to happen? Mary says, okay, how are you going to do this? Because to me it looks impossible. So I believe it, but how are you going to do it? Because I'm a virgin. And this is very important here. If you look at how this has been put together, look at the pages of your Bible, Luke wants us to notice the difference between Mary and Zechariah when Gabriel gives them the news. He wants us to see Mary, this insignificant teenage girl, and her faithful response to what God's plan was, in contrast to the faithless response of one of the priests of Israel. Gabriel points out that God is going to do something with her. He's already doing something with Elizabeth, her relative. Apparently she didn't know, and I assume that would have been a shock. What do you mean? She's pregnant? But he had something even greater for her. And that's another thing that Luke is doing in showing that John the Baptist was great, and he was important. But Jesus is even greater and more important. And so Mary's great faith and her humility and her acceptance of what God was going to do from her are shown, and she essentially says in verse 38, I am your servant, do whatever you want with me. I am willing, I will accept whatever you have. She humbly submitted to God's plan and was willing to serve however God wanted her to. She didn't understand. She didn't know what was going to come ahead. She didn't realize the depth of the pain that she would later experience either. But she was willing, whatever God had for her, that she would accept. And that really, verse 45, as we continue, Mary comes to visit Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, the baby jumps in her womb and is filled with the Spirit, and she begins to prophesy. And one of the most important verses there is in verse 45. She says this of Mary, and blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her from the Lord. And this was what was great about Mary's faith. She believed what God told her, even when she didn't understand it, and even when it didn't look like it would be possible. And after this, and what Elizabeth says to her, we have, which we're not going to be able to get into much detail at all here, we have Mary's prayer, which is one of the greatest prayers in the Bible, which is modeled after Hannah's prayer in the books of Samuel, and it's modeled after the Psalms. And it says, and Mary said, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked on the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed, for he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm, he has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever. So Mary looks at this and she says, I'm nobody. But look at what God has done. And she realizes that he is using her to fulfill what he had spoken to the fathers. And she said, I'm nobody, and you're going to use me, and I'm ready. And so we see this lesson in Mary of her faithful acceptance of whatever it was that God had. Luke presents Mary as a faithful person who's not only going to accept what God has, but she's also going to wrestle with what God had in store for her. what he was doing with her and her son and her family. And so throughout chapter 2, for instance, if you wanted to flip there real quick in chapter 2 and verse 19, as people are beginning to say things and she's hearing all of this about what her son was going to be, it says multiple times in chapter 2 that Mary treasured up all of these things, pondering them in her heart. And so Mary's faith is evident, and she is ruminating on what it is that God is going to do, and she's trying to understand, but she's also going to wrestle very heavily. Because if you look, for instance, at chapter 2 in verses 33 through 35, and we won't get into detail about this, but the prophet tells her, your son and all of the things that he's going to do, it's going to pierce you too. You are going to have to wrestle with this about who it is that you are bringing into this world and what it is that he is supposed to do. And it wasn't going to be easy. And you can see some of that reflected in the Gospels, and it's never outrightly said. But we look at this, Mary was a young, probably poor, insignificant girl. She didn't exactly understand what it was that God was going to do with her, but she believed and she glorified God by what he was able to accomplish and what he was going to do. And again, what God noticed about her was not anything that she had on the outside, but that she had faith, that she was favored because of who she was in trusting God, and that she was accepting of what it was that he needed and expected of her. If you read in between the lines of the Gospels, it looks like Mary probably made some mistakes. It looks like maybe she wasn't the perfect mother because it's not clear that she believed Jesus about who he was while he was conducting his ministry. And there's some of that tension that the gospel writers show, and it's not explicitly said, this is my suggestion, but it looks as though Mary didn't fully embrace and accept the reality of who Jesus was until after his resurrection. That is when we see them numbered with the disciples. But her faith and her acceptance are still given to us as an example. And part of that example is the wrestling and the honesty and the acceptance of what it was that God was going to do. And so Mary's an example for all of us to be willing to submit to God's will, whatever it is that he wants. God, whatever you're going to do with me, I'm willing. And I will be your servant. And we see that whatever it demanded, she went through it. And look at what God did through her. If you think about it for a second, we are all sitting in this room because of that teenage girl. And how amazing it was that God did that. But Luke's story doesn't stop there either. If you continue into chapter 2, John the Baptist is born and Jesus is born, and they do all of the things that the law required that they should do for purification and for the dedication of the firstborn males. And there's almost this, what seems to be a throwaway part that Luke includes here. So in chapter 2, as you look at verse 22, they come to the temple to dedicate him to the Lord as the firstborn male. And there was this man Simeon in verse 25. He was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, the redemption of Israel, God's plan. And it says the Spirit is upon him, and he prophesies to Mary and to Joseph about this boy. Or I should say this baby. Let's look at verse 27. This won't be on the screen yet. And he came in the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms, and he blessed God. And he said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all the peoples a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. And that's where we get that idea of then he turns to the parents and says, and this is really going to affect you too. And they wonder about that. And in verse 36, we're introduced to another person. If you notice that Luke likes to pair up a man and a woman and use them as contrast and example. And in verse 36 it says, and there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. And there in verse 37, it's not exactly clear if she was a widow for 84 years or if she was 84 years old and had been a widow up to that point. But the point is that it was a long, long time. And she did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. Just this one little paragraph. And you kind of think, well, what's going on here? But it also almost seems like a random extra in the story, but Luke includes it on purpose. And he's showing that there were faithful people involved in preparing and announcing the Son of God's appearance. And announcing and heralding this to Israel and everything that was about to happen. She might not have seemed to be very important to many people, but she was to God. You think about this. An old widow by herself. She was at the temple every day, and people probably got used to seeing her all the time, and so then you just stop seeing her because she's just always there. And so this is another case where we see someone who might be perceived as insignificant or unimportant that God specifically uses. She'd been a widow for a very long time, and I think also what's implied in that is that she didn't have any children either. She was married to her husband for a short time, and now she's here alone. But God used her as a prophet to his people to announce the coming of the Son of God. And we see here in Anna that she was a prophet of the kingdom, no matter how unimportant she seemed. She had been waiting for the coming of the kingdom, the redemption of Israel, as it talks about in this chapter. And if you notice the prophecy by Simeon there, it seems to be the catalyst for her, because it said at that very hour, that moment where Simeon is prophesying, she sees, oh, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for, this baby here. The prophecy of praise by Simeon right before prompts her to give thanks to God, and it says that she goes around telling everyone what was happening, what was about to occur because of this little baby. She had a big part to play. You can imagine almost maybe the chaos that would happen in that situation of Simeon's going on about this little baby, and the parents look confused, and then Anna comes up and she sees him, and then she's running around telling everybody about what's about to happen. And you kind of realize that something is happening here. But someone might think, what would this old widow have to do with the coming Messiah in his kingdom? How could God use someone like that? But as we've seen with Elizabeth, and we've seen with Mary, and now you see with Anna, it doesn't matter what situation they're in. It doesn't matter their predicament or their age or what has happened to them in life. God can use whomever he wants, and he does use different people of different backgrounds and experiences and situations to glorify him and to carry out his plan. So even in her situation, alone for however many years, probably ignored, and sometimes widows would be marginalized in those societies and forgotten even though they weren't supposed to be. God used her as a faithful herald for what he was doing in his world. The biggest events in history, she gets to announce. And so it doesn't matter the life stage that we're in or the situation that we're in, God can use you like that, as he did with Anna. and as he did with Elizabeth, and as he did with Mary. And so we see these, and we see these women, and that Luke has intentionally pointed them out for us. That they were examples, and that they were people that God used to carry out his purposes in bringing his son and in rescuing humanity. And so as we look at these women that God used in these events, we see young and old and alone and powerless over things like fertility and circumstances. But God used them all to become spiritual mothers and to be sisters and to benefit the kingdom. And so we need to recognize that for one, but I also want you to ask yourself today, and this is really some of the biggest reflection of what women has God used in my life, not only to bless me, but to do his work. Because we do not give enough attention to this. We give too much attention to things like this that I'm doing. And we do not give enough attention to the other people that God is using for his work in his kingdom. So on Mother's Day, as hopefully we've become aware that we should expand our perspective, what mothers and sisters and daughters has God used in my life to bless me and to do the things that carry out his will? And how can we better appreciate these mothers and daughters and sisters that God has gifted us? And then, of course, the question as we see as they're examples to all of us is, how can he use me? When we look at these stories and we see that our situations and our circumstances and our age and our background, they do not matter to God, because he can do anything. As it was said earlier in the story, nothing is impossible with God. How can he use me? What circumstances might he be able to bring me through? What things am I maybe using as an excuse or a barrier that God can actually bring me through in order to accomplish his will? As we think about these examples, we could add to this list Rahab and Deborah and Abigail and Priscilla and Phoebe, and we could add so many others. The women whom God used to carry out his plan as co-workers in the kingdom. Where would we be without them? Where would we be without Elizabeth bringing John the Baptist and Mary bringing the Son of God? We are still talking about them 2,000 years later. These random people from the backwoods of Israel across the globe, we are talking about them because of what God was able to accomplish in their lives. And so there are no limits to what God can do with us. And those that he uses may often surprise us, but that's exactly why he does it. As the apostles make clear in some of their later writings, he does that to show his power, even in our insignificance. God can glorify himself in using our insignificance to show what he is able to do. And so let's be thankful for that and be looking at what God has done and is doing in our lives. And so as we close, I want you to think that God grants us all of these relationships in the kingdom. Fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters, daughters, sons. And he uses all of us to accomplish his will. He's called all of us into this family of God to have a part. He calls all people into his family to be adopted as his children, where he can be father over them and show, for one, what a family is supposed to be. He can give us what we're lacking in our lives and make up for what we perceive as our insignificance or our bad circumstances, and he can break through all of those things and make us whole and use us to accomplish what he wants to do. But we have to be willing. And so really the invitation today is just to come to the Father. Maybe you've done that, but look and see if there's anywhere that you are resisting what he wants you to do for him. Maybe there's some work or there's some situation or opportunity that God is nudging you toward that he wants you to do for him, come to the Father and allow him to do it. Or maybe you're not able to see past your immediate circumstances or your background, and you don't understand how it is that I could have any place or that I could contribute anything. But look at these women that we examine today and realize that that's not the truth. And maybe you're outside of all of this, and you want what God is offering, and to be of use to him, and to have this Father who is what a father should be. He is calling you to accept that and to become part of his family, and we can help you to do that. If this applies to you, appeals to you, just talk to us and let us know, and we'll give you some time to think about that as we stand and sing.